This is Randy, the Atari-based podcast.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit podcast. I'm Kay Savitz. In this episode, 2 interviews with the same person recorded more than 4 years apart. Dan Noguerol is better known to the Atari community as Farb. He is the mastermind behind the Atari 8-Bit Software Preservation Initiative, and years ago created SIO to Arduino, an Arduino-based disk drive emulator. I interviewed Farb on August 29, 2019, where he talked primarily about the Atari 8-Bit Software Preservation Initiative. That interview took place at the Fujiama Atari event in Lengenfeld, Germany. Our friend Roland Wassenberg sat in on that interview. Shortly after doing that interview, I learned that Randy Kindig had also interviewed Farb on April 20th, 2015, but got busy and hadn't published that interview. So, in this episode, 2 interviews with Farb. My more recent interview first, then we'll go back to 2015 to hear Randy's interview.
So first of all, you live in Germany?
I do, yeah.
What are you doing in Germany? Because you don't have a German accent, you're from Colorado?
I'm actually from New York.
New York,
and,
okay.
Lived in Colorado for 15 years.
So you live in Germany for work?
My wife and I just wanted to move to Germany. Well, we wanted to move to Europe, and Germany was the easiest place for us to get to. Mm-hmm. We had been to Germany a few times, and we just really enjoyed the time that we spent here. So
How long have you lived here?
Just over 2 years now.
And have you been to this Fujiama show before?
This is my third.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Why do you come?
Just to see. These are folks that I interact with. Mm-hmm. So some of them I'm talking on WhatsApp every day, and so it's nice to spend FaceTime with people and see people that I don't get to interact with often.
Sure. It's been a trip for me to put faces to the names that I've seen on forums for a decade.
That was my first time here. It was like, oh, Roland, I know Lucky Buck, but I had never met Roland.
Right.
So
right.
Yeah, there was a lot of that.
So I want to talk to you mostly about your preservation project. Mm-hmm. It seems to me it's taken a few different iterations and recently has a new version, a new website and stuff. So let's talk about, first of all, why are you doing this? And then we'll talk about how you're doing this.
Okay.
So.
Well, and it's not just me. There's a team of folks at this point.
You're at the head of the table, aren't you?
I mean, I kicked it off. We'll put it that way.
Right.
So why? I mean, basically, I started with just my stack of original Atari discs that I had sitting in my basement, and I went to boot 1 or 2 of them, and they didn't work. And I suddenly kind of freaked out about it, and it made me realize that magnetic media is fairly fragile. It's well past its rated lifespan, and it's something that I think is worth preserving, since there's a lot of software out there that some of it common, some of it rare, but I think it's all worth preserving. Mm-hmm.
You're using CowerFlux or SCP to get the best possible definitive files. How's that going? How much progress have you made? How many?
We are, I would say, probably at about 3,000 or so flux level dumps that we've done. And so a lot of that is, one of the goals of the project was to create, you could call it definitive. So we wanted to identify, there's been multiple releases of many titles, and so figuring out which releases are unique and kind of identifying those, but then also creating a verified version of each of those releases, which requires us to have multiple dumps of the same title, but across multiple physical disks, so that we can do a comparison and figure out, does this have data corruption, does this not, and can we create?
And you don't consider something verified until you have 2 identical?
Until we have 2 things that have been, one at least from a verified original physical disk, and then the other can be a happy backup, or ideally another original physical disk, but they have to verify. So the disk and the sector interleave, everything needs to be identical for it to be considered verified.
Do you follow 4am on Twitter?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the many things I've learned from him over time is that at least in the Apple II world, he does Apple II software preservation. Mm-hmm. Many times there will be multiple versions of a program released over time, but there's no different version number. There's no way to tell that version A is version from version B or version C, other than he's looked at the flux level dumps and go, oh yeah, these sectors have changed. Have you found that sort of thing in the Atari world?
It's the same thing, yeah. So we will, sometimes it'll come down to somebody actually looking at the assembly or the binary code and saying, well, this does something slightly different. So there's usually not a version number. And so there are cases where we know there's a difference, but we're not entirely sure what that difference is. And so we just catalog that as an alternate dump, basically.
How will you know when you're done?
Good question. I don't know that we will ever know we're done. I guess we'll be done when no one is contributing software anymore and there's nothing else for us to dump.
Right.
Then we'll be done.
And the thing I've learned from, go back to 4AM and the Apple II world, I think the Apple II had perhaps a wider, much deeper collection of weird software, educational titles and scientific stuff, and the Atari was a games machine, and I mean I'm putting that in air quotes, but really relatively little serious software, educational software was released for it versus say the Apple II. So maybe we as Atari archivists have an easier job.
I'm actually finding it surprising how many educational titles were released for Atari.
Really?
And so I think when somebody had asked me how many titles I estimated were released for Atari, I remember thinking somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000, maybe 5,000. And as we're getting into like these esoteric educational titles that were not commonly advertised in like the mainstream Atari publications, it's surprising how many we're finding, and we're still finding. So it's been difficult even to determine what is out there or what was made exactly, let alone try to dump it.
So how are you finding what's out there?
At this point, I mean, there's been a really good group of people that have been acquiring discs and dumping, and either dumping them or letting us dump them. So it's really been community contributions at this point. So there's some fairly dedicated folks who are willing to spend both their time and money to do this and to acquire things. So this would not be possible without all of them.
How many people do you think are helping?
Oof. I would say probably in the neighborhood of 15 or so at this point.
So originally, when I was trying to help with this, it was basically done on an Atari Age forum, a very busy thread that went on for 300 pages.
Yes.
And I think my sense is, tell me if I'm right or wrong, that you're trying to clean that up and make it easier, but you created a website that is can you tell me about that effort? Yeah.
So, I mean, originally I think I had a Google spreadsheet that I was tracking these things on, and that sort of got unwieldy. And so I put it into a Postgres database and started managing it that way. But obviously no one had any visibility, and that's where the website came from. So it's kind of evolved from something very, very simple into something that now is kind of a collaborative platform for the folks that do contribute. They can go in and they can edit things. So that's kind of evolved over time. And so obviously people that aren't involved in the project don't see that. They just see the normal face of the website.
Right.
And so we've recently introduced a forum within there so that, to your point, that Atari Age thread was getting pretty unwieldy and there was a lot of noise going on as well. So it didn't make sense to have all of these discussions happening on one thread. And so we now have a forum that we collaborate on, and all the people that contribute to the project. So it makes things easier to track and for everybody to communicate what they're doing.
Can you explain to the listener who might not understand why a flux level dump is better than just copying some sectors off of a disk using a DOS or something like that?
Okay, so really, I mean, a flux level dump, when you think about the surface of the disk, you've got magnetic particles on there, and they can either be in one of two positions, positive or negative, so to speak. And so when you image something at that level, it's irregardless of disk format, it's irregardless of the system that it was written for. It's truly at the closest we can get to the physical level of the disk. And so when we capture things in that way, if another Atari format comes out in the future, we can create images in that format because we've got those low-level dumps. It also means that we can analyze those things at a much lower level if we need to. So if there's anomalies or there's issues or there's something we don't fully understand, we can analyze that And so there's not very many folks that can do that, and I can't do that myself either. I need to have it at a higher level format, but there are folks that can do that.
Right.
And so we do try to archive all of those, even though they take up much more space than a standard Atari floppy would.
Sure.
That gives us that flexibility, so we do archive all of the flux dumps that we keep, or that we dump.
Sure. It's like having the physical disk. If this goes back into someone's basement or whatever, then it's gone forever. But you have the flux dump. It's as good as having the disk.
It's as close as we're going to get, without having it.
I think the flux dumper that is most widely known is probably Cryoflux.
Cryoflux, yeah.
Say it again?
Cryoflux.
Cryoflux.
Yes.
I've been drinking beer, and we're at Fujiama. I've been learning about SCP.
A SuperCard Pro.
Yeah, SuperCard Pro, which is another dumper. Do you have an opinion about which is better for Atari preservation?
So that's a good question. I actually had to create a flow chart on the website. So what's your goal? Do you want to image an original disk? Do you care about double-sided? Because there's no perfect solution to the problem. Do you want to write back? Yeah. And so I have both of them because neither one is ideal. And so Cryoflux is much better for imaging disks that are flippy disks. So there's data on both sides. Mm-hmm. SuperCard Pro can do it, but it only works with certain drives. The SuperCard Pro software has some challenges, which there's Farb on Atari Age created a tool called A8 Raw Conv that we use, and that can actually talk to SuperCard Pro directly. Mm-hmm. And so we will use that where we can, because to avoid the SuperCard Pro's software, since it doesn't work, especially for Atari, it doesn't work as well as we'd like it to. Mm-hmm. So Cryoflux is better for doing flippy disks, but SuperCard Pro is good for writing disks back, or writing images back to physical disks. So it doesn't work as well with flux dumps and writing those back, but if you take an ATX file that we've created from a flux dump, that can be written back fairly reliably. And so it really depends what you're after. And so I use both of them pretty regularly.
So how can the average Atari user help?
Basically just scouring the disks they have. So I've just recently added a want list to the website of things that we don't currently have, or things that we have that we need to verify. And so if folks could look and see if they have any of the things that are on the want list. And then there are a number of people in the US that can do these dumps. There are a number of people in Europe that can do them. So folks can either ship their disks to these people and they'll get them back, or if they're really interested and they're willing to devote some more time and money to it, then we can help with information on what hardware they would need to get and how to do this stuff. So depends on the level of involvement people want.
Sure.
But in case of emergencies, we can travel with a Cryoflux to the user. It's a very rare disk, of course. But you have changed your website to my opinion, very major advancement, and that is that the user, if he's in possession of a very, very rare disk, can look after whether it's in the archive or not. So you just don't have to look all the lists, and not just a wanted list, of course, but if it's even a disk the community doesn't know of, let's say a prototype or so on, they can look after in your data bank, and if there's a match, then it's okay. If it's green light and double check, no problem. But is there no entry? Please let us know.
That is a very good point. Yeah, if it's not there, if we don't know about it, then it's not going to be in the want list. Yeah. So, right. Good point.
What else haven't I asked you about this project that I should have?
Well, I mean, some of the folks that have contributed, I think, it's important. So we've got Fred in the Netherlands, who is routinely dumping cassettes. So we've been I've been primarily focused on discs, but we've recently, I would say in the past year or so, seen a lot more cassette contributions. And so that's really taken off to the point that I can't keep up with it anymore. And so.
And for that, do you just need a WAV file of the cassette? Or
yeah, I mean, I think you've done some of them yourself.
I've done a few.
Yeah.
The thing is, and I was going to wait till after the interview to mention this, but I've tried contributing, and I did some WAV files of cassettes, and then I sent them in, and I probably did it wrong, or the computer was doing other things, or who knows, but I sent them in, and there's a problem with these, can you do them again? And so, I mean, my workflow is I like to do something, I put it aside, I'm done with
Yes.
it. And then all of a sudden it becomes, I have to go find these 5 cassettes that didn't read right
Yes.
and do it again, and I don't even know why they didn't read right in the first place. And so it became, instead of something I could sort of do in the background while I'm doing other work, it became a management task that I wasn't prepared for.
Yes.
That was just tapes. With discs, I just bought an SCP. I don't have it yet.
Mm-hmm.
But I found the Kyroflux software difficult to use.
To say the least, yeah.
And then I was feeding the Kyroflux data to the conversion software. What was it called?
Rockcon.
Yeah. And I found that difficult to use. And also, sometimes I would find that the thing, it seemed to read fine in the Kyroflux, but then it was just completely didn't work. It could have failed at the first level of reading, at the second level of conversion, and in either of those things, it would have failed, and it failed completely invisibly to me.
Yeah.
And, I sort of think I know what I'm doing with things some of the time, and so I'd submit something, and then it would be like, it was bad, and, and then, so I found, again, the workflow for me at the time was frustrating and more management than so I ask you honestly, as someone who wants to have everything preserved and wants to be a part of this, how can I do it without everything sucking?
I will fully admit, so this initiative.
And although this was back when everything was by forum,
Yes.
and so it was.
The support structure is a little better than it used to be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So.
But to your point, yes, the tools that we're using, they come from various sources, and none of it is really user friendly. It's intended for fairly technical folks to use. I don't think anyone's been apologetic about that aspect of it. Including even the tools that I've developed, they're geared towards folks that kind of understand this stuff, and it's not for beginners, so to speak. You raise a good point, though. This notion of having to dump things multiple times, we run into that on both the cassette and the disc side. So a lot of times, and I see it more so with discs than cassettes, to be honest, but a lot of times because the magnetic media is starting to fail, when you run it through a disk drive, it's actually going to deposit gunk on the head. So some of the actual surface of the disk will come off and be on the drive head. And so you'll start a disk dump, and you'll have an initial good read of the first few sectors, and then the head starts to get dirty, and then it kind of goes downhill from there.
Right.
And so we do have situations where someone will dump a disk, and we'll start analyzing it and say, looks good. Oh, that's not looking so good. And by the end of the disk, there's no data, right? And so our first reaction is, hey, would you mind cleaning your drive head and redumping the disk? And a lot of times a second dump of the same disk, because it's already been run through once and all that stuff has come up, a second read with a clean head will actually work okay. So yes, it's frustrating, and we run into it all the time, even with stuff we're dumping, where when I was doing it myself, I had the benefit of analyzing it immediately and going, oh, that wasn't good, let me run it through again. And other folks don't have that benefit until we can look at it. So raises another thing, though. For folks that care about preserving this stuff, one of the worst things you can do is actually run this through an Atari drive, because some of these disks you're only going to get one shot with, especially for like Synapse disks are a good example of they're failing pretty badly, and you may only get one read off of those disks.
So what should you put it into PC drive using your Kyroflux? Or?
Ideally, yeah, if we can get a flux dump of that before it's run through anything else, that's the ideal situation. So if it's something that really needs to be preserved, I would encourage folks not to run it through their Atari drives to make sure it works, but to give it to someone that can actually do a flux dump.
Interesting.
That is why I've told you about the ATX in 90 seconds program, which is mainly an Apple use of the technique. As far as the disk is not a hard one, let's say it this way. But we can arrange it for you, no problem.
Every year when I go to Kansas Fest, 4am sits there with his dumping station and reads. This year they did more than 1,000 discs. They had 3 or 4 stations.
Oh wow!
Watching them work, I mean, there was it would just like and little green lights would appear on the screen for every good sector, and if it was a bad sector, you knew right away it was red. So their software is maybe a little more refined than what we're using. When I'm doing the Kyroflux, it's just a page full of text and numbers that mean nothing to me. And
To be honest, most of them mean nothing to me too.
yeah, okay. So, and anyway, I enjoy. They had instant feedback of whether something was likely to be good or not, because it was just little grid of green squares, except for the one red one in the middle, and then they could force that one to go back.
Yep.
And so.
Yeah, and the SuperCard Pro software, I think, has something like that. The problem, and even CryoFlux, if you do a raw level dump, which is what we normally do, there's not much you can tell from that because you're not applying any sort of system information to it, or system-specific disk format information.
Yeah.
With CryoFlux, I believe you can also tell it to dump the Atari format at the same time, and then you can get some feedback to show this read well, this didn't read well. Problem is with copy protection, some of that stuff's going to look like it didn't read well, and it might actually be correct.
Right.
So we kind of don't pay attention to that stuff anymore and just stick with the raw stuff and analyze it after the fact.
Okay.
So I realize I never really answered your original question. I think the best we can probably do is improve the quality of the tutorials that we have and the how-to guides and so forth to make not the tools easier to use, but at least to make it a little more apparent how you should use them. And so, I mean, when I started this, I couldn't even get information on the command line parameters to give the CryoFlux to get a good dump. And I wound up dumping 50 or so disks with settings that I thought were right. And I submitted them to the CryoFlux guys, and they're like, yeah, you didn't do this right. I got to dump 50 disks again. This sucks. So I think we've gotten better in terms of the information that's out there, but there's going to be room for improvement. Yeah. And I think your experience speaks to the fact that we're not there yet.
Well, I think this is such an important project. It's so vital, and I'm glad you're doing it. And I think there's very little that's more important than to get a complete library of every piece of software that's been made. And I thank you for making the effort.
No, thank you. You've contributed, and Roland's contributed, so we've all had a hand in this. So it's been cool just seeing the community kind of come together. What started as a single man effort became a 2-man effort, and now we have 15 or so people. So
nice. Do you have any other Atari projects happening?
This is consuming all of my available Atari time, unfortunately, and I still have a backlog of probably 200 disk images that I need to get through. Yeah. So
how are you going to spend your weekend here at the Fuji show?
Well, I was intercepted as I came in about a problem with S Drive Max, so that apparently our 810 timings might not be quite right, and so we may do some of that. And there's another person I need to talk to about some of the tools that I've developed around disk analysis to see if there's some improvements we can do there. So
nice.
We'll see.
All right. Thank you very much.
I'm hoping to play some games.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Since this interview was recorded, I received my SuperCard Pro and have used it to digitize a couple of hundred Atari discs. I also digitized dozens of Atari cassette tapes. With the Software Preservation Initiative's new website, the process has gotten a lot easier. The CryoFlux, see, I can say it now, and SuperCard Pro hardware and software still isn't as foolproof as I'd like, but there's been progress on that front for sure. Next, Randy's 2015 interview. In it, they discuss the Software Preservation Initiative, which was at a much earlier stage at that point, and also SIO to Arduino. SIO to Arduino is an Atari 8-bit device emulator that runs on the Arduino platform. It connects to Atari 8-bit hardware and emulates a single Atari 1050 disk drive. In the years since this interview was recorded, the project has largely been made obsolete by projects like the S Drive Max and FujiNet. But Farb's work on SIO to Arduino and his generously making it open source absolutely laid the groundwork for these newer hardware projects.
I did look at some of the stuff about your SIO to Arduino, which you mentioned a software preservation project too, and I really couldn't find anything on that, so we'll just
There's nothing really online. I put a posting on Atari Age. I haven't done anything formal online yet.
Do you live out in Colorado, right? Is that right?
I do, yeah.
Are you near Denver, or?
I am just south of Denver. So I am currently a software engineer. I've been so for past 20 years or so. At the moment, I am working for myself. I've got my own company, and I'm working on an open source home automation system. So that's been consuming my time for the past 6 months or so.
Well, that sounds like fun.
Yeah, it's actually been a lot of fun. That'd work.
So how did you get started with Atari computers?
Let's see, I was probably about 9 years old. My dad, actually the family had bought an Atari 800. They had it for, 6 months or so, and they couldn't get me off of it. And so when I was in third grade, my parents got me my own computer so they could actually get access to theirs again. And that kind of started the whole thing. I attribute my becoming a software engineer to playing with Atari and learning BASIC and learning how to program and all of that. It was super exciting and really enjoyable, and I kind of been doing it ever since. So on various computers, but the Atari is still kind of near and dear to my heart, just because that was the first.
That was your first, and that was the one you learned on. You say it was an 800?
It was a 400. My parents had the 800.
Okay.
400 with that awful membrane keyboard that just hurt your fingers.
Not great to type on, but it was serviceable, I guess.
It worked.
Yeah.
It worked. And we actually upgraded it, I guess, after a year or so. They had those aftermarket, I guess, quote unquote, normal keyboards. They were better to type on than the membrane, but not great either.
Oh, you mean you eventually replaced the keyboard on the 400 with more of a standard? I've seen those.
I wish I still had it. I'm assuming not very many of them were out there, but who knows?
It sounds like you didn't keep it. How long did you actually use your Atari computer then?
Oh, I didn't keep the 400. I eventually graduated to an 800 when they got inexpensive enough to upgrade.
Sure.
Briefly had an 800 XL, and that was probably the last Atari I had before I moved on to a PC. So, but I stuck with Atari up until probably the early 90s.
Oh, so you stuck with the 8-bits until you moved to the IBM PC.
Yeah, pretty much. My first computer after the Atari was, I think, a 386. So,
Wow.
Yeah.
You definitely stuck with it longer than a lot of people did. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was. First, it took me a long time to save up for a 386 computer. So the Atari was all I had.
So when did you get back into it then? When did you decide that you wanted to get another Atari and kind of get back into it?
Well, I never actually needed to get another Atari because I kept all of my Atari stuff. So it was just a question of when I pulled it out again. I don't know. It's kind of been an on and off thing ever since, even when I went to the PC. So a lot of it was, playing around with emulators. Then I'd go back to using the real hardware. And I feel like the Atari's never really gone away. It just kind of peaks and valleys where I just get off into other things, and then something on the Atari side interests me again, and I seem to get involved with it again.
Okay. When you said you moved on to IBM compatible, I assumed you got rid of your Atari stuff, but you kept it and still
just
pulled
went into the basement and just didn't have it set up anymore.
So then at some point in time, you decided you were going to work on a hardware project involving the Atari 8-bits. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. When I did start playing with the Ataris again, I guess mid-90s or so, maybe late 90s, whenever it was, I had downloaded the Atari peripheral emulator, the APE software that Steve Tucker made.
Right.
I thought it was really cool, but it was, I guess when I originally used it, you needed MS-DOS, and later he created a Windows version, so I used that for a while, but once I became a Mac user, I didn't have ready access to a Windows PC anymore, so I really liked the software, but there wasn't an easy way to use it, and so it just seemed kind of goofy to have this high-powered PC just to emulate the SIO disk drives, so I wanted to create some sort of a standalone SIO emulator that could use off-the-shelf components and kind of do at least the disk side of what APE could do. And I was kind of disappointed with everything I had seen out there because nothing really did the copy-protected disk formats like Pro and ATX. And so that was part of it, was not only did I want to create some standalone hardware for this, but also something that could do the protected disk formats as well. And so that was an interesting challenge because neither of those formats are particularly well documented. And so, I had to, at least for Pro, I had to do some reverse engineering and kind of figure out how its disk format was working. And for ATX, I worked a little bit with the creator of that format, but he didn't seem particularly interested in documenting it fully. So there was a little bit of reverse engineering on that side too. But what I found was, the memory constraints of the Arduino were such that doing the full timing emulation on the drive or for the disks was going to be really difficult. So basically, around that time, I started to see other platforms like the BeagleBone and later the Intel Edison that have a lot more horsepower. And so my hope was, rather than to continue to try to refine the Arduino side, to maybe re-implement something on one of those more powerful platforms. But time just hasn't allowed it so far.
So at the time that you started this, which was what, maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago? How long ago was that?
Probably something like that, yeah.
Yeah. So the Arduino was fairly new at that time?
It was new to me. I don't know how long it had been around. I had done one other project with it for my business, and it just, once I did that work, it was like, oh, this would be kind of a neat platform to do something for the Atari with. And that was kind of the genesis of it.
So what is the current state of the project?
At the moment, it works. It only does single density disk formats, so it doesn't do anything with double density or hard drive images or anything like that. I've been told by a few people that they successfully built it and used it, and I know a few people had even made some software changes to it. So I haven't seen any of the code that was written, but it seems like people have had some success with it.
I saw some videos out on YouTube about it, apparently people who had built this project. So, apparently it does work. So
I didn't know there were YouTube videos. That's cool.
Yeah. I found a few. Now, some of them were I think one was in French. And now I noticed he had some software that it came up with so that he could pick, what drive image he wanted to use. So is that all part of what you did?
So there is another hardware SIO emulator called S-Drive. And the people that created the S-Drive hardware had written a program that runs on the Atari that allows you to, over SIO, browse the list of images that are on the SD card and select something to actually mount. And so I had put in some emulation into SIO2 Arduino to do the same thing, so you could run that S-Drive software. And again, that was, that part is a little bit shaky because I didn't see that the SIO protocol that S-Drive was using documented anywhere. And so I literally was, I had a logic analyzer hooked up to the serial port to look at the packets or the frames that being exchanged, just to try to figure out exactly what was going on there. So it seemed to work, but I don't know to what degree or what level of compatibility it actually has.
And all the software that you developed for the Arduino side is up on GitHub, correct?
Yeah, it's open source.
Yeah. Have you gotten any feedback at all about it from people?
I've heard from a few people that looked at it, and they said nice things about the source code, so that was kind of good to hear. But and as I mentioned, I know at least 2 people have made changes to it, and as the Arduino libraries evolve and newer versions come out, compatibility needs to remain there. So I know at least one person I think they were using a newer version of the FAT library that it uses to access the SD card, and I think newer versions didn't work, but older versions did or something. So there may be some maintenance that needs to occur there. But as far as I know, if you use the versions of the libraries that it was written against, everything works fine.
Are you planning to do anything more with it, or is that pretty much the end of your involvement there? You've taken it as far as you want?
I'd like to eventually revisit it. Like I said, since I started the home automation thing, that's consumed all of both my work and personal time. So with the exception of the little bit of Atari preservation stuff that I've been doing, but at the moment, it's not looking good to at least have me jump into it again. And if I did, I might consider doing something with some more powerful hardware, just so that I can refine the ATX support.
Sure. Okay. Well, I just recently got an Arduino. I'm a little far behind, I guess. And so when I came across this project, Yeah, I think I saw you talking about it on, maybe it was on Atari Age or somewhere. That's where I contacted you, wasn't it, on Atari Age? And was kind of excited about that and wanted to find out more about it. So I don't know. I'm not a strong hardware guy. I don't know that if I could build this or not, but it certainly sounded interesting. Be fun to play with.
Yeah, and there's, from a hardware perspective, there's not really much to it. You just need to hook up an SIO connector to the appropriate pins on the Arduino. So there's not a ton that needs to be done.
And it works with any of the Arduinos, basically, correct?
It will work with, I've tested it with the Uno and the Mega 256. And the Mega 256 has a little bit more memory, so it can do a little bit more, I think, ATX and Pro emulation. If I think back, I believe that the ATX stuff doesn't work on the Uno. It only works on the Mega 256. So there were defines in the source code that you could specify what board you were using, and it would turn on and off features appropriately.
Well, that's really, really interesting. It'd be really cool to see you take that further with another platform and see if you could extend that even more. Now, there are a lot of options out there. You know, you probably own one of the SD drive options, right? Like the SIO to SD from Lothric or something like that.
Yep, yeah, I have one of those.
Yeah, those are really nice.
Those are nice. You can do a lot with the enhanced density and double density and so forth, but I still, to this day, I'm not aware of any of those type of devices that can do Pro and ATX stuff.
Right.
If I saw something, I'd probably start using it myself and not bother with SIO2 Arduino anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, that definitely does make it unique. You took it a little further than some people have done. Well, very nice. So I want to get into the next topic here. You mentioned software preservation. So you've got an active project going on where you're trying to preserve Atari 8-bit software. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I guess it kind of goes in tandem with the Pro and ATX support in SIO2 Arduino. But I have a pretty sizable Atari floppy disk collection, and I had acquired a CryoFlux board a while back, which basically is a flux level imager. So you hook up a standard 1.2 megabyte PC floppy drive to it, and it can image the Atari disks at the flux level. So I was working again with the creator of ATX. He had written a converter program that could take the what CryoFlux calls their stream files, and he wrote something that can convert those stream files into ATX files. And in the process of imaging all of those disks, I was finding that a lot of the disks, I stored them properly. They weren't in any sort of humid environments. They were in disk cases and in disk sleeves and stuff. But quite a few of the disks didn't boot anymore. When I looked at them, they had spotting and stuff on the disk surface. So it was just a symptom of age that, or in some cases, I would actually boot the disk. It would work once, and then it wouldn't boot again after that. So, and I was pretty good about keeping my drive heads clean, and if I heard any strange noises, I'd stop, clean the drive heads with alcohol and so forth. But it just seemed like, these disks are well past their shelf life, and so they're starting to go bad. And so I wound up imaging all of my stuff, and some of the disks that had gone bad I acquired through other sources and imaged them that way. But I had sent out, or I put a posting on Atari Age when I was going through this, and asking people, or I guess warning people that this is happening, these disks aren't going to last forever, so we may want to start trying to preserve them and create images of them. And so Feyron on Atari Age also had spent some time, and he created a nice converter program that could do stream to ATX as well, because the one that the ATX creator had made, I don't think he ever released. So once Feyron released his converter program, that kind of got me interested in things again, because CryoFlux's Atari support in their core software isn't particularly great. I think you can create XFD files, and that's about it. So you can't do anything really fancy. So Feyron doing his converter actually made a big difference, because now we can create ATX files ourselves from our original disks.
So what's your ultimate goal with this? Are you actually actively contacting people and trying to acquire disks and software that might need to be preserved? Are you going to that extent, or?
Not yet. So I put the posting on Atari Age. I've had 2 members actually send me some of their disks, which I imaged and sent them back their disks and sent them images of them as well. I guess the ultimate goal is to, so I've got a list up on Google as a Google Doc that lists everything that I've preserved so far. The ultimate goal is going to be to get as many images of disks as I can and then just release them to the public, I guess probably through Atari Age or, creating some sort of a torrent or something that everybody can download these. But, the goal would be to try to just preserve as much software as we can before these disks go bad. But ultimately, I want to contribute everything that I've done back to the community.
So are you using archive.org to archive any of this stuff?
No, I'm actually not familiar with archive.org.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, that's their goal is to preserve as much of our digital history as possible. And you can submit files up there, files, scans, documents, books, whatever, and they will preserve it. They pretty much have unlimited storage. Something you might want to consider because it is likely to be around for a good long time. And other places that you might put it, you don't know, right? You don't know how long it might be around, and you might store it somewhere, and then eventually that could go away, and then it's gone, just gone.
Yep.
So.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good suggestion.
Yeah, you might check that out. So this is something that let's say I was talking to, Chuck Peavy or somebody like that, and they had some discs. In fact, he told me he had some discs that he doubted could be read anymore. Mm-hmm. Is that the sort of thing that you could help me get data off of if I contacted you?
Possibly. I mean, it depends. It depends how bad the disk is.
Sure.
I've had some disks that won't boot in an actual Atari, but when I run them through the CryoFlux imager, it actually does, I think, 5 or 6 passes on each sector. And so if it can get, more than one good read, their own software will actually grab what it thinks is going to be the most likely good data. And so I've had disks that won't actually boot on Atari, but when I created an image of them, they were good.
Right. Yeah. So certainly there's a better chance that it can retrieve data than just because it won't boot on an Atari doesn't mean that there's not something useful on there.
Yeah, well, it's possible.
That's great. That's good.
It could probably be recovered from the image as well if somebody really knew what they were doing. I haven't gotten involved at that level yet.
So how can others help with this? Is there anything that anyone else can do to help you with this, or?
At the moment, the best way to help is if people have software that's not currently on the list of titles that we flagged as preserved. And when I call things preserved, it's either Atari Mania has them flagged in red on their site, saying that it's an image that they know came from an original. Those are in my list as preserved as well, and in the list I have a column specifically for what's the source of the preservation. So it's either Atari Age, and in the case of cartridges, I know there was an Atari Age user that was maintaining a cartridge list with CRCs of known good cartridges, so I included those. So basically anything that's not in that list that people have physical disks for, the way I've been working it is if they send it to me, I'll pay for the postage to get it back to them, and we'll send them the images that I create as well.
Very nice. How would people find out more about this? Just Atari Age?
At the moment, Atari Age, I do want to create some sort of a web presence for it, and maybe move the list off of Google Docs. I just haven't gotten around to doing that yet.
That sounds very interesting. It certainly is something that I know the Antic staff would be very, very much willing to help as much as we can there, because that's one of our goals, is to preserve the Atari 8-bit stuff. So are you doing this for just Atari 8-bit stuff, or are you doing it for other types of computer software as well?
I've been focusing mostly on Atari 8-bit. Obviously some of the 8-bit stuff had Commodore programs on the other side.
On the other side, sure. I've got some.
So
like
as
that.
I'm imaging, I've been contributing the Commodore stuff to, I'm trying to think of the name of the person. Well, certainly the Supercard Pro author, Jim Drew. I contributed some stuff back to him because I also have a Supercard Pro imager, and so I was creating SCP files in addition to the CryoFlux stuff. And then there is another gentleman who I think he's on Lemon 64, maybe the Commodore site, and he had created an FTP site for people that were doing CryoFlux images of Commodore software, and so I contributed the images that I'd done back to his FTP site as well.
Mm-hmm.
But myself personally, I've stayed focused on the 8-bit primarily.
And I'm sorry, what did you say you're doing with those images right now? Are you putting them on a site, or you just have them stored at your location, or?
At the moment, they're just on my NAS.
Okay.
So I need to figure out the best place to get them off site.
Sure. Wow. Okay. Well, that's very cool. That's a neat project. It's great that you're spending time to do that, and it's something that's strongly needed as discs start to go. And it's pretty hit and miss these days. When you stick a disc in, you don't know if you're going to be able to read it or not.
Yep.
In fact, it may work today, and tomorrow you put it in and it doesn't. So you just don't know.
Yeah, and I think even some of the folks that have contributed discs found that I wasn't able to image some of the stuff just because it had already gotten to that point.
Yeah, too far gone, huh?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. So how many Atari computers do you actually own today?
Probably 5 or so.
Okay.
In fact, my wife was making fun of me. I had a pile of Atari 1050 drives, and when we moved to Colorado, we had to pack all of those up, and she was asking me why I had so many of these. Well, she didn't realize what they were, but she's asking me why I had so many of these 1050 drives, and it was one of those things when you buy them on eBay, you get them in a lot of 2 or 3, at least at the time.
Yeah.
And I found that even those over time have started to not work anymore. So I'm probably down to maybe 2 working ones. But yeah, probably 5 computers. I've got a couple of 1050s, a couple of Indus GT drives.
So do you have like one of each of the models on the computers, or do you like a specific model?
I still have my original 800. Got, I think, 2 130XEs. I kind of just like that model because it was smaller and just kind of fits nicely in a corner. I think I have a 800XL, a 1200XL, probably no 400 anymore.
Do you attend any vintage computer shows? Do you ever get a chance to do that?
I do not. I've thought about doing it a few times, but it would have involved travel, and the timing just didn't work out. But I'd still like to. It still seems like it'd be a fun thing to do.
To be honest, they don't have as many in the West as they do in the East, which is kind of strange, actually.
Yeah.
And you're in the Denver area, so you'd think there'd be something there. You have any links that you'd like to mention or to include in the show notes?
I'm trying to think. I had just moved off a lot of the stuff that I'd done. There was a time that I was running a site called Atari8bit.org, and I had let the domain expire, and the domain registrar wanted a lot of money to get the domain back, so I just kind of let it go, and I moved everything under my blog site. But if you go to www.farbish.com, that's kind of a retro computing blog that I have, which I haven't really been contributing a whole lot to recently, but I've got some of the old Atari8bit.org interviews that I did and stuff up there, and that's probably it.
Okay, excellent. Anything else that you're working on Atari-wise that I should have asked you about or that you'd like to talk about?
No, that's probably it. I wish I had more time to devote to this stuff, but I probably already spend more time on it than I should.
It's amazing, how many people are involved with, some really high-tech, modern stuff, and yet they still work with the old Atari 8-bits sometimes, just like you've done. I mean, you have your own software company, right? It's amazing that you found time to do some work on your Ataris.
Yeah, it's enjoyable. It's still fun to boot them up, and I still enjoy just firing up old Atari games and playing them. So, in fact, I'm using the Mist. I guess Lotharic and at least one other gentleman did their FPGA hardware that
right. I've
that
heard
there's
of
a Atari 800 core for.
Uh-huh.
So I use that quite a bit in lieu of firing up an actual Atari. It works pretty well.
Oh, do you really? I always wondered about that. I knew there was an Atari 800 core, but I never could find much information on it. So you were able to find that, download it, and install it on the Mist, and it works well, huh?
Yeah, it does. And I ran into the same thing. There wasn't a ton of information, so I contacted the author of the core and offered to write a manual for him. So that PDF manual that's out there right now is one that I worked on.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that's pretty cool.
Hopefully it'll make it easier for other people to get rolling with it, because it's a cool device and it's a nice core. The compatibility seems pretty good.
So you think it works better than many of the emulators?
I would say so. Probably not better than Altera. I think Altera is still probably the best 8-bit emulator out there, but it's nice to have it running on real hardware, and the fine scrolling and stuff all seems to work well, and the fact that you can hook it up to a modern television pretty easily is a nice benefit versus I still have my old Commodore monitor if I hook up my real Atari, so it's a much smaller screen, much older display.
Yeah.
So it's cool to be able to hook it up to a regular LCD television.
Yeah, that would be nice. Well, that's cool. I had never talked to anyone who had bought one of those and didn't know how well that worked, so that's good to know. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, Dan. I really appreciate your time. I like some of the stuff you've done. I hope you are able to find more time to work on Atari 8-bit stuff. And I just want to thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thank you. This was fun. Nice first podcast that I've ever done, so that's neat.
Okay. All right, see you later.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
Bye.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute, make a tax-deductible contribution to the Internet Archive, a nonprofit digital library that has done incredible things to preserve computer history. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate. Thanks.